Thank you very much, and thank you for coming out this evening. I know there's lots else going on. What I'm going to present today is not a talk per se, and I will probably alter a little bit the initial idea that I had for what I wanted to present. But really what I'm going to share with you today, I think, are some framing contexts and intellectual tendencies, a set of reflections, really, for your discussion and feedback. So this is really very much an open set of comments or a kind of commentary, and it's going to be touching on a number of issues, and so I look forward to your feedback and your questions. And it is a chance to think together from our different relationships to the present. So what I want to do is to start by discussing how caste, as system and structure, has been approached, before I briefly address the changing scholarship on caste, which responds both to a set of intellectual shifts in the ways we approach caste as an analytic and our location in the political present. In the second part of this presentation, I want to think about caste in the classroom, both here in India and in the United States, where I teach, as a way to enter a conversation about current discussions about global caste. And then I'll present a short bit from the book I'm currently working on, Ambedkar in America, and use that as a way to reflect on a remarkable, if under-acknowledged, challenge to standard positions on caste before its time, so to speak. I'll be discussing Ambedkar's essay, Castes in India. And broadly speaking, really the idea and the effort is to present discussions about caste as a vibrant field of discussion and debate, centering a set of conversations about self and other, the questions of democracy in the South that caste poses for us, and indeed the broader question of political ethics. So here's the first part, which is a kind of ground clearing in terms of the study of caste. So caste operates, I suggest, as affect, as identity. It structures social experience, and it is an analytic. Like religion and gender, it functions as a practice of social cleavage and a form of collectivity both. That is, it both differentiates and it creates new forms of, and it creates new social groupings. So caste structures fields of power. It functions as a form of social capital in the present and of inherited privilege from the past. The one element of caste that everyone recognizes because it is so pervasive is caste's role in regulating marriage, sexuality, and reproduction. And this is perhaps its most significant aspect, so caste's role in regulating the social reproduction of caste and the relationship between sex and the social. The other aspect of caste that I just wanted to put forward is the argument that I've made that caste functions as something like a political unconscious of the Indian social, and the arguments that many have made, many political scientists and theorists in particular, that we see here in India a rather distinctive process of democratization through caste and through what I would call a politics of minority, which transforms the ways in which we might understand democracy itself as both an idea and its many histories. So caste in that sense is relational. It's always been equated with the Indian social, and it's been attributed, as you all know, to deep-rooted religious concepts and conceptions and shared beliefs such as of purity and pollution, occupational hierarchy, and so forth, all of which characterize the interaction between different castes. And so I would say, as a historical anthropologist, the anthropologist or the sociological side of me would say that the caste question then is an inquiry into the logic of group formation, the sociological puzzle of group coherence and social organization, whether it's questions of kinship, tribe, lineage, and state, and so forth, but how we really move towards complex social formations. And it's worth noting two things here. One, that sociology itself, the discipline, has always had a tense relationship with ideas of liberal individualism, or at least sociology has made its adjustments with dominant strains of Western political thought, right? Predicated on the social contract, the liberal individual, the acquisitive individual, and so on. So the idea here of, what makes groups, what creates groups, and how do groups operate is in a fundamental tension, actually, within the traditions of both sociology and political thought, or politics, political science in a more heterodox world, as it were. The second is that sociology and the question, as I've said, of group formation itself contains within it a kind of historicism that is kind of baked in, if I can put it that way. And this really happens through the idea that there are stages through which societies move, right? That there is kinship, there is clan, there is state formation, but that there is a kind of developmentalism that's built into the ways that societies cohere, operate, and then develop and mature in some sense, right? And so this also means that comparison, the idea of historical comparison, is built or baked into sociological categories themselves, right? That kinship is prior and perhaps pre-political in relationship to the ways that we think about the state, and so on and so forth. So the question of kind of sociology thinking about society synchronically, as we suggest, right? So society is something that's kind of opened out and available to us to both experience and analyze, also has or contains within it a kind of historicism. And I think this is quite important. This is, as I said, the anthropological or the sociological part of me. But there's also a kind of conversation here about caste's own history and the many histories of caste, the kind of inbuilt historicity of caste as a concept, which is to say that caste is neither singular nor unchanging. And so to the sociologist's interest in thinking about the group, how it coheres, how it reproduces itself, how it organizes itself, you've got a set of historical questions about caste itself and the ways in which the category of caste has changed and could be historicized, right? And here you could say that historians, ancient, medieval, early modern, have focused on a number of issues. One, the emergence of things like regionally distinct castes who are associated with militarized pre-colonial regimes. So the emergence of what we today think of as dominant castes, right? Marathas, Rajputs, Gaudas, etc. That these are actually castes that come into historical emergence in the context of their relationship, for instance, with the Mughal Empire, with various notions of the ways in which a militarized society operates, and broadly speaking, kind of pre-colonial formations. There's also a kind of history, or historians have looked at caste's analytic utility for colonial governance and for strategies of so-called indirect rule. That is, that caste becomes, in the colonial period, a bureaucratic identity, right? It's used to kind of name, describe, identify, categorize different caste communities, but to also begin to think about them proportionally, right? Sort of what is the relationship of caste A to caste B in numerical terms, and so on and so forth. And so a kind of historical process to thinking about caste itself as morphing, right? Transforming what we understand the category of caste to be. And the role of caste in structuring relationships of labor and the appropriation of surplus, the access to capital itself, but really that the history of caste, I think, must be seen in conversation with the history of territory and the control over land. Right? So all of this to suggest, in a sense, that there is a kind of complex field of play. Right? This is the broader set of studies around caste, both historically and sociologically, that one comes into. I'm sorry, I've forgotten my... Okay, here we are, okay. So in that sense, anthropologists in particular focused on hierarchy, on caste as what was called a manifestation of cosmological holism, that caste was a structure that encompassed the different castes into a kind of hierarchical formation. This is a an argument that is made most importantly by Louis Dumont, who many of you might have heard of, an important sociologist, anthropologist, who writes a text called Homo Hierarchicus, and alongside that also writes a text called From Mandeville to Marx. And Dumont's argument really is to think about caste hierarchy and the hierarchies of caste as being, he does many things, but one of the important things that he does there is to think about the hierarchies of caste as being in absolute opposition to the idea of equality. Right? And I'll come back to this. Or we may think of the model of Sanskritization and Westernization, or the two together, as a way to think about historical transformation from within the caste system itself by Bangalore's own M.N. Srinivas. You have scholars of a Marxist persuasion, historians, anthropologists, political theorists, and scientists, and so on, who think about caste as something like a historic remnant, something that's backward, right, and might transform into class. And again, as I've said, you've got a number of historians who are thinking in quite complicated ways about how caste operates across society, and who begin to think in many ways about caste, I would suggest, on its own terms, and the internal logic of caste, its relationship to capital, to society, to politics, and so on. I might think about historians like Didi Kosambi, for instance, B.D. Chattopadhyay, and more recently, Manu Devadevan, who won the Infosys Prize some years ago for this fantastic, magnificent book called The Prehistory of Hinduism, all of whom begin to really think about the ways in which caste operates as a kind of complex social whole, right? And working across, a kind of working in a cross-disciplinary manner, really, to do that work. Everything from archaeology and geology to thinking about literature, I suppose. Right? However, there is a sort of major fault line, it seems to me, in the way that we continue to think about caste and societies of caste. Right? And that has, despite all of these shifts, despite the complex ways in which people have tried to think about caste as a complicated form of inequality, of hierarchy, of stigma, and so on, there tends to be a broad divide or a division, a major fault line, you might say, which really hews along the lines of Western theory or theorists of Western political society, tending to think about caste as a form of non-political difference, that is, as a manifestation of hierarchy, and something that contrasts with the idea of equality. Right? And I think that divide has tended to really be quite operative. And it takes shape in different forms, different theorists and academics might think about that division in different ways, but I think the idea of caste really is something attached to societies of the East, if you will, and something that doesn't sit well with the question or the problem of equality. I think is one really big remaining fault line. And a lot of the new conceptual work and a lot of the new academic and intellectual work has really tried to rethink that fundamental divide. The second, I think, is perhaps another fault line or another divide, which operates for scholars of South Asia themselves. And here is where the kind of critique and some of the major critiques of the ignoring of caste, including by critical caste studies, I think comes in, which is that scholars of South Asia, typically those who have tended to think about caste, its social pertinence and its importance, its analytic centrality for understanding Indian society, have also tended, by and large, to accept that caste is somehow historically distinct, that it is somehow subcontinental. It's a form of subcontinental difference. And so the fault line here, or these two kind of major fault lines, what they do together is, I think, to prevent us from thinking about the politics of caste, the political ethics of caste, if you will, in perhaps a more robust, globally ramified fashion, but also to think about the ways in which caste might itself function as a very important and distinctive form of inequality. Right? And And so for those, I think, who analyze caste as it exists, that is, as a system and a structure, you want to think about this analytically, address how it impacts those perniciously affected by it, that is, the marginalized, the discriminated, the exploited, the challenge really lies in explaining how this complex form of social inequality persists in a post-colonial society, right? If caste was supposed to become class, well, why does it exist? If we don't, or you've got people who really think about caste as a kind of social embarrassment, not to mention a social evil, from the late colonial period onwards. And so there the question is, if caste is simply just going to wither away in liberal democratic societies, why is it that it seems to be transforming, morphing, and changing shape, but perduring in a number of different ways? And scholars have asked a similar question about race and racism, right? That we know race because of the ways in which racism manifests, both as a form of legislated inequality, you might say, but also through new forms and formations of prejudice, exclusion, right? Social forms of exclusion, questions around public access, and so on and so forth, right? And so I think that becomes, in a sense, the puzzle, if you will, for those who are both interested in analyzing caste and in thinking about, if you will, the annihilation of caste, right? How do we engage in that dual project, both of thinking the thing itself and thinking about its disappearance or the ways in which we might work towards its disappearance? Especially in a context where anti-colonialism and anti-colonial nationalism has often taken up all the oxygen in the room. And I know many of you might challenge this, right? But the argument has been that anti-colonial thought, both sociologically, that is in terms of the people on the ground who name themselves as anti-colonial activists and thinkers, but also in the way that anti-colonial thought operates as a challenge to colonial sovereignty, ideas around self-determination and so on, that that ends up taking up all of the oxygen in the room. And one could even think about the critiques of Gandhi and Gandhianism that have been made by numerous Ambedkarites or Dalit activists, not to mention Ambedkar himself, right? And Gandhi perhaps would be the sort of both the most radical and the one that really stands at the limits of thinking about the ways in which anti-colonialism begins to try to begins to approach the question of caste, casteism, and caste exclusion. And so the new conversation, so this is just really a bit of ground clearing to give you a sense of what is at stake, that there's been a lot of conversation, a lot of writing about caste. No one who studies South Asia can ignore the question of caste, as they cannot ignore the question of religion and gender. As I said, these are major cleavages. But to just begin to give you a sense that there is a multidisciplinary conversation around caste, but the conversation really here is about how to understand what it is, right? How do we give it a kind of social or an analytic rigor, if you will, and not quite, interested perhaps in thinking about the question of abolition and annihilation of caste. So these new conversations about caste, which are happening very much as a result of anti-caste political and cultural formations on the ground today, ongoing protest around the invisibilization of issues of access and exclusion within the academy, and the new formations of violence and censorship within and without the academy, must be located within, in the context of this historical study, or the analytical study of caste that I've proposed and put forward to you. And we also have today, of course, the new focus on traveling caste, on caste in the South Asian diaspora, both in the UK and now in the US, where there's an absolutely vibrant and extremely contentious, conflicted conversation going on. And this is the kind of social surround, if you will, that I think has forced a new moment of reckoning. There have been many moments before, but just to think through the present moment. Right? So if we do think about the present, how would we historicize the present? Right? Really now not thinking so much about caste as an analytic, but also bringing caste perhaps into the domain of everyday life and social practice. Right? So where do we find ourselves? So if we think about the present then, we could probably think about the last 30 years, which is, I guess, the present for me. So we could start with Mandal and Mandal 2, the ways in which Mandal and Kamandal come together, right? Hindutva 1.0, if I can put it that way. which marks that moment around a kind of new or a rethinking of caste and the study of caste. Numerous other what we might call critical events, the World Conference Against Racism in 2001, the rise of the BSP, which I think is absolutely significant because the BSP, unlike other Dalit political formations in other regions, including in Maharashtra where I work, actually becomes a kind of main player in the political firmament, right? Unlike other Dalit political parties, which remain in some sense, either in a position of creating coalitions or being co-opted and so on. The BSP really takes over a very distinctive political space. So I think that's a critical event, if you will. There's the questions and the many, many, many critiques and conversations around Ambedkar and the textbook controversy. There's Rohit Vemula. There's the changing nature more broadly yet of caste and class relations in this period of neoliberalism, where the state is profoundly transforming the face of the state. We're in a period of jobless growth for the last 2 decades at least, and in the midst of a massive agrarian crisis. So in many ways, all of the kind of fundaments, not just of the late colonial period, which I spoke to you a little bit about, but the moment of constitutionalism and beyond that of Nehruvian development and developmentalism is really fully and firmly over, right? And we need to think about some of the ground conditions of the nature of the state, politics, the economy, and so forth, that are shaping and reshaping the conversations of caste as well. So like earlier moments of crisis, what historians might call a conjuncture, where a number of social forces are in flux and come together also to divert the status quo, we are in one such moment now. And these broader sociopolitical changes are indeed underway, spurred by a change, as I said, in the state form, the privatization of welfarism, jobless growth, the agrarian crisis, the new forms and the emergent forms of precarity, which I think are also transforming the ways in which we think about both caste and class, and these new emergent, what I might just call caste-class formations that we see. But what we see, I think, very broadly, and I will just put this forward, and we can take this up for conversation, I'd very much like to, but I think the current moment that we find ourselves in, the absolute current moment, is that what we are seeing on the ground is a kind of interesting relationship between two particular minority communities and minority formations, and the ways in which they are aligning or are related to the broader project of Hindu majoritarianism. And I think here what we see is that Muslim communities are increasingly ghettoized, and they're experiencing a near total exclusion from political power, certainly if we think about this in terms of the post-colonial moment and constitutionalism. Meanwhile, Dalit communities are vulnerable, excessively visible to the state in contemporary India in a number of ways, from political party formations to caste atrocities, the conversations, the ongoing questions around gender and sexuality, and so on. So insurgent mobilization and persistent demands for affirmative action, reservations notwithstanding, social exclusion and violence are key mechanisms by which Dalits' visibility is manifest, and caste privilege is also being reproduced. So in a sense of negative externality, that is the excision from the body politic, defines Muslims' relationship to the Indian state today. Dalits, I want to suggest, are marked by forms of negative sociality, that is practices of prejudice, humiliation, corporal violence, that secure the relationship between Dalits and caste Hindus. So in many ways, this is a question of a kind of internal and an external process of minoritization, if I can put it that way. And please bear this in mind. I'll come back to this question of negative sociality and what I call the asocial sociality of caste towards the end of my talk. This logic of the ways in which a kind of dominant majority organizes itself around what I would call a kind of situation of competing minoritization, or a very interesting and paradoxical relationship between two very significant minority communities, carries over and is really a hangover. It's an aftermath of colonial politics, and the colonial identification of Hindus and Muslims as majority and minority communities, and the very complex and changing status of the scheduled castes, Dalits, in this equation. And I think this continues to structure democratic politics in India today. And it produces a very interesting, from a theoretical perspective, and on the ground, a very difficult set of political predicaments in the ways in which we are to think about what's happening to democratic formations today. So I'm just going to leave that there, just to give you a sense of the present in terms of where we are now, as a kind of add-on to the analytic study of caste that I put before you. So now I want to move to this question of critical studies and where they stand and what they're doing. So in my own mind, I distinguish, given this kind of a background that I've laid out before you, I distinguish three interrelated spaces, which I don't think can be compared with each other. So I think there is the question of critical caste studies, what is happening to caste today, caste as indeed the interesting jati varna formation that we know, take it either at the textual level of varna, or take caste on the ground in terms of jati, regional caste clusters. But I think caste itself and what it is profoundly transforming today. And so critical caste studies, in some sense, is an effort to think and to forefront, it seems to me, a kind of project of politicizing the category of caste in this kind of critical manner across the disciplines. So this really has a very long genealogy, and this is what I've tried to suggest, that the study of caste is long. People have tried to understand what caste is. They might not have thought about how to end caste. But I think caste studies kind of stands in that space. And I'm bringing this forward because there have been a lot of conversations and a lot of debate, I think, in the broader public sphere around the new emergent studies of caste and the kind of different studies and different formations that are emerging. The second and quite distinctive formation in the study of caste is Dalit studies. And I think that has a very distinctive project of thinking about the excluded, the stigmatized, the kind of minority form, if you will, right? What is both inside and outside, apart, as Ambedkar would call it. But Dalit studies is quite distinctive in the ways it thinks about the project both of identity. I mean, the focus is on Dalits, so we need to know who they are, where they stand, and how they operate in relationship to a broader community of caste. And then a whole distinctive set of conversations about the relationship of Dalit studies to African American political thought, for instance, other forms of solidarity and affinity that Dalit studies might be in conversation with, if you will, but also distinctive cultural and political formations. And I do want to distinguish this from the study of caste, because I think if we think about critical caste studies and what's happening with the broader transformation of caste, we also need to put a lot of pressure on the, let me use this term, this is not the right term, but the kind of exceptional status that Dalit studies has created for itself. Because I think there are very new antagonisms that are emerging in the public sphere and in the public political space that we need to think through by putting critical caste studies and Dalit studies in conversation with each other. And finally, and importantly to me, because this is what I'll talk to you about for the rest of my time with you, is this space of anti-caste political philosophy or social thought. And this really is an effort to think about anti-caste thought as a specific form of thought, which is to say that it carries a systematicity to it. There are governing terms and concepts. For instance, the term Shudra Atishudra for Phule, who tries to imagine a new community of the dispossessed, right, is itself a technical term for him. It's a political vocabulary that he creates, right? Ambedkar's own use of the term social democracy is a technical term. And when I say technical, I mean that it is a term of art, right? He uses it, he reuses it, he experiments with what he means by the term. And so we see a kind of internal, if you will, consistency or a debate in the ways in which anti-caste thought is trying to think about the terms through which it wants to understand society. And this, I think, is absolutely critical because earlier studies whether it's of working class protests or rebellion, or even the Subaltern Studies Collective, which puts forward a very interesting argument about where and how we should think about political agency. For all of those earlier formations, the focus actually is on action, right? That people resist, and we know it because they did something, right? They went out, they protested, something transformed, they rebelled, and so on. But the question of thought itself as such is not prioritized. And I think this is the real focus and the force of anti-caste thought, the effort to think Ambedkar as a thinker, right? And we have any number of studies. I think they're all biographies, and they're not, most of them are not doing the kind of work on anti-caste political philosophy, but we can discuss that as well. But I think this turn towards thinking about anti-caste thought as a formation, as an intellectual formation, is extremely important, right? And I think it's there that we begin to see, and what I'm suggesting to you here also is that there are different intellectual stakes, constituencies, and forms of reading or interpretive practices that gather around people who want to think about critical caste studies versus Dalit studies versus, anti-caste thought. They constitute their object and their analysis, their forms of investigation differently. They have intellectual genealogies that I don't think should be collapsed the one into the other. There might be some value to thinking about the difference of these streams of thought, as well as their points of intersection. And the first step in this critique, and I'll just sort of go through this in a sense to think through what's entailed in the kind of pressure that these forms of thought are putting on the work that we do as academics, as pedagogues, as students, and so on. And the first step, of course, has been a kind of claim to place oneself, right? That one wants to think through the kind of function of where one is placed socially, sociologically. And I think this is a very difficult thing to do. It's quite easy to say, well, this is who I am. I come from a Deshasta Brahmin family. I grew up in Bangalore for the first 10 years of my life. I was introduced to African-American political thought, which formed a very important aspect of the ways in which I began to think about questions of racialization, and that it is through this that one comes to caste. I mean, that kind of intellectual biography is an easy thing to do. But I think the more difficult question to ask is, what really does that kind of social and intellectual formation do? Because identity, of course, is not destiny, right? And identitarianism can also shut down conversations. I'm saying things that others have said. I don't think there's anything new or distinctive here to what I'm saying. But it does seem to me that there is something very important in asking this question as well. Because when we talk about caste, can there be a more subtle and pernicious divide than caste's fundamental division between thinking and doing? The entire caste order is predicated on the divide between intellectual and manual labor, right? And so, the political theorist Gopal Guru has described this divide and the ways it continues into the academy as one between, or a divide between, theoretical Brahmins and empirical Shudras, right? But I like better what my good friend Aniket Zavre called beautifully and quite powerfully as the difference between societies of inheritance, which is caste, versus societies of acquisition, what one comes into, which is, we tend to think of this as class or chosen communities rather than inherited or embodied ones, right? Gender, too, would be a society, if you will, of inheritance. And so it seems to me that here the question really that's being asked, or the ways in which the new conversations about caste, the pressure that they're putting on thinking about intellectual labor itself, is that they're asking us to work with a model of complicity and responsibility. That this is a model of unlearning, if you will. This is the way I think of it. And it does pose some very important questions, and I think and work as my field site is the classroom. So it does pose a lot of questions about the sociology of the classroom, questions of representation, the conversations around merit, which are pernicious, to put it mildly, and are a kind of red herring in the broader conversation about inherited privilege. Challenges to the work of disciplines, disciplinarity, how we do the work we do as academic, academics, embedded inequalities, and the invisibilizing of exclusions and the ways in which we might participate in them. So let me just say a couple of things, and I'm going to move and end with the Ambedkar reading, the Caste in India reading. I'll try to do this quite quickly. So the Indian context here is quite paradoxical, it seems to me, because the state mandates commitments to social inclusion, which have tended to prioritize caste. Democratization has actually happened through the category of caste. And yet, as we know, an institutional Brahmanism perdures. Caste-oppressed students are stigmatized, they're contrasted with students who enter universities by merit. There's an assumed denial as well of caste in the classroom. And so the question of what we mean by democratic education, both the question of democratic access and inclusion at the point of entry, but more significantly, education as civic formation, right? That place where one might create or craft something like the constitutional morality that Ambedkar talks about can be modeled, becomes really, difficult and important both. And the reorganization of higher education across the world. I mean, I'm coming from Columbia, where we have had encampments on campus, and there is an ongoing assault on students, on faculty, on academic freedom, and so on. So it seems to me that the reorganization of higher education globally is making these questions very difficult, even as they're becoming absolutely present. And the university and the classroom is, of course, a very significant place because it is a place for random encounter, cross-caste engagement, and so forth that can occur in less constrained or choreographed circumstances. Young people often don't know who they will become. This is the great thing about it, right? And they don't know which class is going to transform them and so on. The American university classroom today has a substantial representation of students from across the South Asian diaspora. This diaspora is complex and encompasses different histories of indenture and working class struggle on the one hand, as well as elite educational achievement and economic success, post-1965 immigration on the other. And contemporary caste has tended to travel along these circuits of professional attainment, with the composition of South Asians in the US skewed to the predominance of privileged castes, with oppressed castes existing as a minority within a minority. So just as legacy admissions at American universities are now seen to qualify merit-based claims, but always in terms of a legacy of privilege, could we consider caste to be a legacy of historical discrimination that also qualifies for merit-based claims in the US context? And this has been a very difficult dance in some sense, largely because of the ways in which the politics of affirmative action works in the United States, the ways in which caste is discussed or evident or not, the ways in which it's invisibilized, and the really quite major distinction between South Asian diasporic students who might think of affinity and solidarity with other Black and brown communities on the one hand, and South Asians, especially graduate students, who've been part of a kind of South Asian environment here and in the Indian context, and then come to the United States. And all of this, I think, is happening, as I've said, as and in the context where the beneficiaries of inherited privilege claim to be its victims, right? And this is happening across the board, whether it's the assault on affirmative action globally, the EWS, and the ways in which there's been a radical transformation of the logic of reservations in India, whether it be with the Maratha reservations or the EWS, which undoes and inverts the logic of the origins of reservations and the philosophy around it and so on. So this is sort of just the kind of context in which one is operating. And now let me just move to a couple of quick things. And as I said, I will move to Ambedkar, and I'll move to Ambedkar in the classroom at Columbia, because that's really where I wanted to go by opening up the question of caste in the classroom. And I guess two quick things, I'll try to just very briefly mention them. The conversations in the US, of course, there's been a major conversation about caste in the classroom and caste in the diaspora. The other big conversation has been, and many of you I think know this text, but Isabel Wilkerson's text, Caste, Its Origin and Discontents, had an outsized role to play in the conversations about global caste. I think the book is wrong-headed, let me say that. But this is a text that begins by comparing India, the United States, and Nazi Germany as societies of caste. Now, such comparison, the idea of using caste to think about other caste-like formations, including race in the US, was hardly unique, right? But what Wilkerson did, which I think was very interesting, just because the book is a public book, it's not a work that only 200 other people are going to read. It's not an academic monograph in that way. And what Wilkerson did there that I think was very interesting is that she inverted and deprioritized race as the transhistorical signifier in favor of caste's more capacious itineraries. And this, I think, was really significant. Now, the reason she did this was to say race in America is American caste. And so the uses to which she put her own argument, I think, are faulty, to put it mildly. Right? But the idea that Wilkerson tries to think about caste as anterior and structuring is interesting. And it began to open up a whole set of, it renewed interest in questions around historical comparison, including about the caste-race comparison, right? And we could, of course, ask whether the idea of politicizing race might essentialize caste or vice versa. Could we ignore the fact that one system predated the formation of states, while the other was imposed by state power, race, or that one predated capitalism and the other emerged during its peak, slavery and capitalism, right? So all of these questions remain. There's much to be critical of with this text, but I think what Wilkerson did was to play a very big role in the return or a renewed interest in a very long history of race-caste comparison. I won't go into those different moments of comparison, and maybe comparison is the wrong term to use. They are translations or analogies, very often using caste to think about race as a status hierarchy, to think about race as not being merely economic, and so on. And I'd also say that, a large part of the comparison of race and caste is predicated on a kind of conceptual misfire, rather than an effort to really create any complementarity between them. But be that as it may, I think it opened up the question of caste's presumed provincial, the status of caste as a kind of provincial category, right? So efforts to deprovincialize caste. There's a renewed interest in a long history of political solidarity and allyship that has animated internationalism of varying stripes, and the ways in which modern democracies might all be seeking to think about how to redress civic disability and historical discrimination through innovative legal and policy means. So I'm going to end now. Can I take maybe 5 more minutes? Would that be all right? So I'll speak very quickly then. Okay. So what I want to now do is to move to Ambedkar, because Ambedkar has a rather contradictory set of views on the race-caste comparison. And I just briefly want to go over that, and I want to remind you of what I said, that he is somebody who from the very start thinks about the asocial sociability of caste. So a couple of quick things that I just wanted to put forward. I mean, Ambedkar is always innovating, but he's also a person of his time, and he doesn't, none of these ideas come to him de novo. I just want to remind you of the organizing philosophy of the body that caste hews to. Right? So we might recall that the origin of caste is a story of dismemberment of a complex whole that we might call society. Here, the metaphorical social whole is imagined as already separated and divided. It's given a form through the parceling of body parts associated with social function, right? Speech with the Brahmin, the arms with the Kshatriya, and so on, right? So there is really a kind of logic of linking, right, social form or social function with body parts. And when I say this is a logic of dismemberment, we could think about logics of aggregation. I guess the one that comes to mind is Hobbes's Leviathan, where Leviathan is pictured as a, if you've seen the very important photo, I think from the etching from 1658 of Leviathan, this is of a large man who contains multitudes within himself, right? Instead, here we have a logic of dismemberment, right? And so what we see here is a homology, or a kind of, a homology and isomorphism between the social function and body part, which is actually predicated on the mutilation of the body. The body politic is torn asunder. It's divided at its very origin. And I think this is extremely important, because Ambedkar too argued that the social whole, and I'm thinking about that first text, Castes in India, the one that he writes when he is a student sitting in the classroom, being exposed to a number of sociological theories. It's a very eclectic, kind of a crazy text actually, 15 pages, a very difficult text, I think, to read, and people have tended to read it somewhat easily. But in any case, in that text, that very early text, Ambedkar too will begin to argue that the social whole is internally divided in the society of caste. This is something that he keeps coming back to. He does this with greater force in the Annihilation of Caste, of course. In fact, he will argue that the whole is so internally divided that it is neither the sum of its parts, nor can it represent them. So castes, he will argue, are agonistically related to each other through a violent separation. And they are pulled together by the forces of imitation in that early text, imitation of the Brahmin caste. Caste, there he will argue, is both a living relic, an archaic remnant that has persisted through the perpetuation of Brahmanism as a social power. But caste is also something, it's a social power that is feared, resented, but most of all imitated. And here he draws on a set of theories around imitation, social habit, and so on, drawing on Gabriel Tard, who was locked in a lifelong battle with Durkheim and lost that battle. But in any case, he draws on Tard to think about this logic of imitation. And he talks here, and he does something quite interesting here, which he doesn't really quite return to again, which is that he focuses on imitation and the logic of caste as being psychosocial, right? And he talks about imitation as a psychological act, something between instinct and conscious action, and something that is located, this logic of imitation, he says, is located in very obscure parts of the mind, quote unquote. It's not conscious or accessible to reason. But because imitation is prevalent across society, no one can ignore the infection of imitation. So social mimesis, he will argue, is an element of a kind of social psychology. And this, Ambedkar wants to argue, is absolutely crucial in thinking about the logic of caste. So Brahmanism mimetically reproduced, down the graded hierarchy, right? That caste is a graded inequality. This is one important argument that he makes, right? And the second important argument that he makes, of course, and you know this well too, is the argument about caste and Brahmanism itself as being predicated, as being dependent on repetitive sexual violation and violence. Right? So the logic of the surplus woman, so the ideas that attach especially to upper caste women around sati, widow remarriage, child marriage and so forth, that all of these, he argues, are ways in which we can think through the social order of caste as being fundamentally dependent on a sexual ordering, right? As well as this logic of annihilation, the disposability of the surplus woman, as Ambedkar will argue. So these two logics, one socio-sexual on the one hand, and the other psychosocial, are both put forward in this early text in order to explain the ways in which caste originates, perdures, and reproduces itself, a fundamental sociological question of what kind of a group does caste form. And in response to his own question, what is the class that raised an enclosure around itself in order to become a caste? Ambedkar will go into the logic of the exclusivity of the Brahmin and argue right from the get-go that this is a political and rather than a natural ordering of the social. 20 years later, in the Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar prioritizes the relationship between untouchability and Hindu religion as the point of contradiction that brings caste itself, the idea, the system, to crisis. He will note that Hindu society as such does not exist. It is only a collection of castes. But in this early text, and I think I'll stop here, because I think this is an extremely sophisticated analysis of caste as a political philosophy, what Ambedkar alerts us to is the fundamental asociality of caste. So in a sense, Ambedkar uses all of the tools of the sociologist who wants to understand how groups are formed in order to tell us that fundamentally caste is this exceptional, crazy, schizophrenic social structure, which is actually predicated on the fact that society cannot cohere, that a caste society is actually an impossibility, right? That society actually can't exist, right? And that what we have is a set of, fractions, I suppose. I think this is a very, very profound early rendering and rethinking of the order of caste as being predicated not just on violence, but on its asociality, right? That castes actually don't interact. They don't have intercourse with each other. And it puts forward a kind of radical challenge to the entire history of the analysis or the scholarship of caste that I began by talking to you about. And so in the end is the beginning, and the beginning is the end. But let me end with that. Questions? Sure.
Please wait for the mic.
Thank you. It's a very stimulating talk, makes one think, so I shouldn't rush into questions. But I would like you to say something about Dalit feminism. Because when does it come into being? What is its significance, and what is its political importance today?
Okay. So in terms of dating it, I don't know if I should say that you've always had, in some sense, Dalit feminism. But if you want to think about, I guess, the contemporary conversations, one way to think about it would be the kind of formations that emerged, the National Federation of Dalit Women, for instance, that emerged in a sense in the aftermath of the WCAR. There is the text that the much cited, Dalit women talk differently, and so on, that begins to mark a kind of moment, I suppose, in the 80s and the 90s, if that's the question that you're asking, how and when does it come about? And it emerges also, of course, as an intense challenge, both to kind of mainstream hegemonic feminism on the one hand, and it emerges as a challenge to patriarchal formations, patriarchal caste formations within the community as well, right? So that, I think, would be the pressure or the force of Dalit feminism, if that's what you're suggesting. But when I said, how to date this, has there always been sort of Dalit feminism, I think one could go back and read, and as I have, certainly Ambedkar, but there are others, but I think Ambedkar is a feminist. He puts forward a very insurgent, what one would consider a feminist argument, right? Which is actually thinking about the relationship between sexual reproduction and social reproduction, right? So sex and the social, that analytic argument that he makes and provides, I think, is a profound feminist one, which is that social reproduction is predicated on the regulation and the control of sexuality. Except that caste also is that kind of schizophrenic, odd thing, because it's not just about regulating lineage, purity, the name of the father, and regulating caste through endogamy, but it's also the fact that alongside this, You have what he himself he's a little confused by it, but he opens up and really begins to think about in other writings too, where he'll make the argument that the exogamous nature of caste also produced a whole range of, I will not call them social misfits, but that, what you end up having is the production of mixed castes, right? So caste is both regulated and caste is transgressed, right? The boundary making function of caste operates along two registers, right? It is constantly being transgressed, and it's constantly being regulated through the imposition of a certain kind of regulating sexual violence or sexual social norm. And I think that becomes very, very interesting to think about the ways in which the history of gender and sexuality are related to the history of caste. And here again, we're talking about something quite present and contemporary and so on, but this has, I think, enormous implication for the way that ancient and medieval historians would think about the ways in which caste operates, right? Caste and kinship, caste and lineage. And there's much to show that indeed these two orders of transgression and regulation are simultaneously operative in the way that caste gets produced. So in that sense, I'd have a hard time. One could keep sort of, going backwards, the kind of infinite regress, if you will, also of saying, how do we think about Dalit feminism? But for us moderns, maybe I would suggest that this would be the kind of operative rubric within which one could think about something like Dalit feminism. Now, the implications also of what you're asking is that a feminist project is not merely analytical, it's diagnostic in the interest of some profound social transformation. And that, I think, depending on how you think about politics and agency, also needs to be sort of qualified. I mean, there's actual movements and social movements and political movements around the Dalit Feminist Project, but I think there's also a lot of quieter forms of experiment and so forth. Discussions about queer family formations, I think, are also part of a kind of Dalit feminist project, right? Because we also need to rethink the category of desire, for instance, it seems to me, when we think about Dalit feminism, because it's fundamentally asking that question about caste as boundary making, if that makes sense. Yes, please.
Hi. Can I speak? Okay, thank you for the talk. I had two questions. One was, could you shed light on the class and caste? Like, it's been used interchangeably now in like modern India and there's a lot of misconception around that as well. So you could just shed more light into that. And secondly, there's this narrative that is there that if you drop surnames, the caste would be eradicated. So I don't know how like, whether it stands the debate or not, but just shed light on that as well. So these two things are there.
Okay, these are two very different questions. I guess, I'll take up the latter question maybe first, which is, by saying Anupama as opposed to saying Anupama Rao, for instance, right? Or getting rid of the caste name or exnominating that last name, right? So think about something like Malcolm X, right? Which is a kind of political project. The naming, the resignification, the redefinition of someone as Dalit itself is also part of that project of renaming, it seems to me. So I think, but you're asking about the name, the actual proper name, I think, right? And is that a project of excluding or unmarking caste? This is an interesting. It's like the project, the Derridian kind of, the X which is crossed out, but you see the crossing out. So there's always that kind of trace, it seems to me as well, of the name and so forth, because caste is, yes, it's the name, but caste is also about other forms of privilege. It's about other kinds of access. And so much of caste today is something that you kind of know, but you can't quite put it into words. This is the everyday affective function of caste too. So to what extent that kind of a project of renaming or removing the name works, I think is quite contextual. I know this is not a great response, but it's just to say that the politics itself has to be recognized. The only way out is through. But is this, what kind of work is it doing? I think it has to be seen together with a number of other social identities maybe, or social affects, if I can put it that way. The caste class question also, this is a really big one. I think it's right that, and I said this myself, that we're seeing a kind of new caste class formation emerging. I think that's right. But how do we think about the divide, or what's the relationship between the two? This is a really very, very vexed question. It's a vexed question, let me put it this way, or I'll put it from the other side. I've just worked with a very good friend in doing an introduction to a translation of a Dalit communist memoir, which was published about 4 years ago. It's called The Many Worlds of Arbi More. And this was somebody who was both a very strong Ambedkarite, was absolutely integral to the Ambedkar movement, played a very important role in conceptualizing the Mahad Satyagraha because he had created other satyagrahas before and so on. But he also became a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, the undivided Communist Party, but then became a part of the CPM, the family, and so on. And that caste-class divide is really profound, right? And especially for Marxists. I will not take up the question of caste. I think the caste question is a profound, misread, misunderstood problem for the mainstream left. And it always has been, because the mainstream left too works according to the kind of telos of developmentalism, right? That caste is a historic remnant, it's backward, it is going to be transformed into something that is class-like. And so caste was never seen on its own terms. Caste itself is a form of, capital. It's also, and itself most fundamentally, a form of organizing relations of labor and labor regimes. And so it seems to me that that vexed conversation is at the back of all of these discussions, which is why you say it's so vexed about how you understand the relationship between caste and class. But today, if we were to think both in terms of what's happening in rural areas, in agrarian areas, but also in urban areas, I think something like a caste class formation is emergent, by which I mean the ways in which material life, questions around precarity, social and economic precarity, and caste identities are somehow contingently related to each other, contingently. There doesn't have to be a necessary relationship. We also have forms of, upward mobility, bourgeois life worlds embraced by many Dalit communities and so on. And so I think that caste-class relationship has to be seen both along two different vectors and maybe the points at which they actually come together, if I can just leave it there.
I just want to ask if you have thought about the idea of Ambedkar as a political theorist for other than for the Dalits. And I ask this because of two elements that have come from his time in Colombia. One is, of course, the influence of Dewey and American pragmatism. And the other is, I don't know if it's the same paper you were citing, but he has this paper in 1916, where he, as a student, where he argues that groups are inevitable and that the individual versus society is, I think he calls it, he's quite contemptuous about. And in that he includes groups like bands of robbers, suggesting that the relationship between groups is much more fluid than we would think in this. Now, in the case of Dalits, that fluidity may not be there, or might be very limited. But in other castes, there is a considerable amount of fluidity in the hierarchy between castes, and which we see now occurring, with the Maratha reservation, etc. You find a large number of such. So this tension between the fluidity between castes and the rigidity. And that may not help very much in understanding Dalit part of the story, but as an instrument to understand the working of caste in the rest of India or in non-Dalit communities, do you think it would be useful?
Again, two questions, as I understand it. So the first one, and I'll come back to this question also of the muddle in the middle, as we call it, right? All the castes that are neither Brahmin nor Dalit in terms of the way that they're identified. But that first question of thinking about Ambedkar as a political thinker, not for the Dalits, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think he is a thinker. And the argument to be made about any form of thought is that it must escape a kind of sociologism and an effort to periodize it, right? I mean, why do you read Locke today? Why do you read Marx today? Why do you read Freud today? Why do you read Ambedkar today? Because there's something about the transcendence of those forms of thought and the kinds of challenge that the thought poses that transcends the sociology of the person, whoever it may be, right? Or feminist thinkers and so. So in that sense, I think Ambedkar absolutely, I would not want to think of as a Dalit political thinker, right? I think what he does is to posit a very distinctive way of understanding the relationship between, let's say, the existential and the social, right? Perhaps in the way that somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois might, or a Frantz Fanon might. But Fanon certainly is not thought of as a Martinican thinker, right? I mean, he is really thought of as somebody who is, well within the worlds of existentialism and so on. And to that extent, I think Ambedkar absolutely has to be thought in that way. I would never think of him as a Dalit political thinker. I would think of him as one of the most significant thinkers of the 20th century globally, right? Because of the ways in which he is working through universal categories. He's always interested in the universal. He's never interested in particularizing, especially his analyses, right? So that, I think, yes. And in fact, it would be an extraordinary disservice to the forms of thought he puts forward to think of him in that manner, it seems to me. Now the question then, does everybody have a right to read Ambedkar? These now are posing other sets of questions, right? Or who actually has a kind of a social set of experiences that allow them to read him in a different way. And those things have to be taken quite seriously. But on the terms and the terrain of thought itself, I think not. Your second question about this muddle in the middle and that there's a lot of fluidity, I think there's a lot of fluidity across the historical landscape for all castes, right? We tend to think that in a sense there's a fixity to those who are at the very top and at the very bottom, right? That the Brahmin, Dalit, if you will, that the two ends in a sense are quite secure. And the argument has been, that the muddle in the middle, so to speak, is the one where there's the greatest degree of fluidity, right? When do Marathas, become dominant caste? When do Marathas become Marathas at all? When are they no longer Kunbis? That historical process is a muddled, a muddled history, if you will. But I think the question or the identity of who Brahmins are and who the scheduled caste, the outcast communities are is also, there's a great deal of fluidity in that. And especially around the question of who is a Brahmin, it's a source of incredible anxiety. Because Brahmins are not, and this becomes part of a very long, both a kind of ancient and a medieval set of conversations about who is the Brahmin, but it gets resurrected in the late 19th and the 20th centuries. Because the argument is that, what's the relationship between, let's say, Brahmins and Kayasthas, for instance, right? Other scribal communities and so on. So caste itself, I think, in that sense, is fluid and transforming. And we may want to rethink our sense that those two ends themselves are rigidly fixed too. But certainly in the modern period, we tend to think of those two ends as being fixed and all the movement is happening in between. And there's probably some truth to that as well. And that's why I said sort of, even the project for critical caste studies is to say, to understand what is happening to caste today. Because there are very new kinds of antagonisms, OBC Dalit, for instance, but in Maharashtra recently we saw the kind of OBC Maratha, contradiction also arising. And so those are creating very new practices and forms of social violence, it seems to me, and conflict too. So that muddle and the fluidity around caste is something that's altering the ways in which we think our society and our politics, I think, too.
Sorry, next question. I'll just quickly go in.
Okay.
I'm here,
Yes,
sorry.
hi.
Hi. Thanks for the talk, and I tend to agree with you as a sociologist who's done sociology as undergrad. I don't think we were trained to think politically about caste, varna, jati in the ways that we actually studied it. So my question is actually about the point you made about Dalit studies and its interaction with critical caste studies, and that there is some tension there. And I wonder, and it leads me to my question on positionality as a researcher. And is the tension existing because in the ways in which, especially in Western academia, caste has been studied by persons of certain caste backgrounds who may not have the social or lived realities, and therefore is that creating that tension, or almost thinking about who gets to study caste or who gets to study Dalit studies, for example, and as researchers, we also end up thinking about it. If you could, reflect on that. And the second one was around questions of power. A lot of times we've studied caste on grounds of purity and pollution and some of these other concepts, but there hasn't been a lot of interaction with power, at least when we've studied it. Is there some more, critical theories that actually reflect on power and caste as well?
Sure. That second one, to me, now I'll wear the historian's hat, as I said, So I think there's been a lot on the relationship between caste and power. I mean, anyone who looks at, let's say, the pre-colonial past is always thinking about caste and power, because, as I said, questions around caste are both regional questions, but they are about the relationship between things like caste, the control over territory, land, and so on and so forth. So that relationship, especially between caste and the control of land, is so powerful and significant that I don't think you can avoid the question of power there. So indeed, and to your point, and I think it's a very nice one, that the sociologists, because they're interested, typically sociology is interested in thinking about, as I started by saying, they're interested in the question of group formation. How do groups form and how do they cohere? So it's the question of social reproduction that is interesting to the sociologist, and maybe less so what might alter that framework, right? Or if it does alter the framework, they really need to find a way of thinking about social transformation. So it might partly have to do with the discipline, but I think to your point there too, I don't know how you could think about, let's say, a sociology of gender that doesn't think about gender's formation within fields of power and the ways in which gender itself operates as a form of power. And here, I suppose one also needs to think about what one means by power. There's domination and subordination. There's a kind of hegemonic, symbolic, or ideological power, and caste has enormous ideological power, right? That's why the young Ambedkar talks about the psychosocial aspect of caste. So the ideology of caste, and this is one of the things that the anti-caste thinkers across the board are very, very interested in. They call it, Fulle talks about it as a kind of stamp on the brain, because they say that, it is the way in which caste actually functions ideologically that's the most difficult thing to get rid of. So to that point, I think there's numerous studies of caste and discipline to the point of critical caste studies. Now, your other question, and I'll try to respond to that very briefly, that is the way that the conversations of caste have taken shape, does that partly have to do with the identity of researchers? Perhaps so. And there is a kind of privileging. That's why I said there's a privileging of the Dalit question, including by upper caste and Brahmin researchers. One is standing right before you right now. So the ways in which one is drawn to, in that sense, the kind of the negated, right? In some sense, and wants to think through that, through the negative, is, I think, probably an important rationale for why this happens. Now, critical caste studies for other castes in the mix, coming back to the muddle in the middle, that question of identifying where you are in the caste structure and what kinds of privileges and exclusions that brings, I think is actually quite difficult, right? So how would a Maratha researcher put themselves into the mix and write about the work that they're doing? So I think you're posing a very, very interesting conundrum, is all I'm saying. I think it's easy now to say, I'm an upper caste researcher, I'm a caste, I come from the caste oppressing communities, and here I am. and therefore please take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt, or an argument about privileging various forms of Dalit life worlds and social experience. But writing from the middle or actually challenging that kind of identitarianism for other castes, I think, is an interesting project. So I'll leave that there.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. How could we think of allyship of this experiencing of the personhood of being in a different spectrum of the caste,
Yeah.
and also with a different,
Yeah.
implication of the caste on the bodies of the different
Yes.
gender across the different zones of this subcontinent, on the neighboring country as well as within this nation.
Yeah.
Could there be possibility of thinking how to de-rationalize this caste or deconstruct it with respect to the bigger timeline, not with just 200 or 300, maybe back for some 2 million years? So how could we also think from those perspective to understand or de-rationalize this? Is there any
Yeah.
consideration in looking the caste in that frame?
So I can't think that timeline for you, and that's purely my own limitation of thinking in that kind of millions. I mean, if one way that you're asking that question is kind of, can we deprioritize the human itself? I mean, that would be one way, I guess, that I'm hearing your question, right? That there's a certain way in which kind of the humanism,